People are accusing Paul of taking it easy, having ulterior motives, that he's just in it for the money. And so now Paul begins to answer these hotshot preachers that are making these accusations against him. And he says this in 2 Corinthians 11:23. He says, are they ministers? He's really casting a shadow of doubt on them. He says, I am more, in labors more abundant. Now, we looked at that yesterday. If you didn't hear it, go to the archive and look it up, because I think you'll learn something very interesting from that phrase, in labors more abundant. But today we're going to look at the next phrase where he says, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths often. And now Paul begins to describe the things he's been through to do his ministry. This man has paid a very high price for the call on his life. Satan's been after him, and he has resisted, and the miracle is Paul is still alive and he's still preaching the gospel. This man's faith, his message, really works. Otherwise, he would have been long gone dead by now. And he says, listen, I've been in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths often, and I'm going to read to you right from Sparkling Gems, and listen to what this says. The word stripes, when he says stripes above measure, is the word phege, and it means to smite, to hit, to wound, or to violently strike. And one of the best examples of this word in the New Testament is in Luke 10:30, where Jesus tells us, and a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and, listen to this, wounded him. That's the word phege, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. That word wounded is the same word, stripes above measure, the word phege. Now listen to me. Notice that the man's wounds in this parable that Jesus gave were so devastating that when the thieves departed, they thought he was dead. These were mortal wounds. Now Paul uses the same word in his testimony to describe the kinds of beatings, physical beatings, he's received as he has sought to fulfill his own God-given assignment in this life. We find another example of this in Acts chapter 16, verse 33, where Paul was beaten. Listen to this. It tells us that Paul and Silas were beaten. Again, it is the word phege, which means they were beaten and beaten and beaten. This was not a light beating, but this was a very severe beating. These were mortal wounds. It was really a miracle that they survived. And in 2 Corinthians 11:23, the verse that we're looking at right now, Paul says he received them above measure. In other words, this didn't just happen once. It's the Greek word huperbalo. The word hooper means over. The word balo means to throw. When you compound the two words together, it's something that is over the top, something that is exceeding, something that is overshooting. Paul says this thing has happened over and over and over and over, and the word huperbalo, I write, describes both the frequency and the intensity of his beatings. The beatings Paul received occurred frequently. They were cruel, severe, merciless acts of brutality, and they happened continually. Yet Paul never threw in the towel, and Paul never stopped. He never gave up. Then he says he was in prisons more frequent. The word prison is the word phulake, and it describes a place of custody, a prison ward, or a place heavily guarded by keepers and watchmen. And I write this. Such a prison was usually a small dark chamber in which the most hardened, dangerous, and menacing prisoners were confined. The prisoners were put into this particular chamber because they were considered so risky, and they were usually accompanied by a host of prison guards who guarded them for 24 hours a day. We would call this solitary confinement. We would call this the strongest, most strictest kind of prison. And Paul says, hey, I've been there often. And then he says he's been in deaths often. And it's very interesting when you read how the Greek says this. It's the word thanatos, which is the word death. But Paul uses the word thanatoi, which means in deaths, plural. Deaths, plural. Paul has been in the situation of deaths many, many times. For instance, he wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 31, I die daily. And most people take this to mean a figure of speech, but the fact is, Paul faced the prospect of death every single day of his life. He could have been killed by pagans. He could have been killed by Roman authorities. He could have been killed in the arena. He could have been killed by gladiators. He could have been killed on the road by bandits. He lived in deaths, plural, constantly facing this prospect. So now we find that Paul has received wounds, over the top wounds above measure, mortal wounds, but he's still alive. We find that he has been held in custody in the most strict prisons of all, guarded 24 hours a day by prison guards because he was considered so dangerous and so risky. And now we find that when he is out of prison, every day he's facing the prospect of a possible death. And yet none of it stopped him. None of it stopped him. What kind of man was this? That none of these things would stop him. He was living for heaven. He knew that he had received a heavenly call. And if Paul was determined to do anything, it was to finish the assignment that was given to him, and he was going to run his race all the way to the end. Now, I know you haven't been through anything as tough as what I've described to you today. You've been through a little hardship. Maybe your feelings have been hurt, but you have not shed your blood. You have not landed in prison. You have not been mortally wounded physically. And with the power of the Holy Spirit, you can pull yourself together. You can get up and go for it again. You can do it. Are you listening to me? You can do it. Say that to yourself. I can do it. I can do it. By Christ's power that operates in you, you can get up and keep going until you finally fulfill the call which God has placed on your life.